At the beginning, a boy thought, "This is bad," because a truck was about to hit a girl. The boy immediately pushed the girl out of the way while thinking that by the time he realized it, he had shielded a little kid and got hit by a truck. After that, he died. When the boy opened his eyes again, he thought that this place was unfamiliar and then remembered that he had died. He wondered why he had done that and thought that maybe, deep down, he had just wanted to do something heroic. He reflected that ever since he was a kid, he had admired protagonists, the heroes in stories who gave him courage and dreams. At some point, he had started wanting to be a cool protagonist like them. Then, the boy heard someone saying how pathetic it was to die like that. When he looked toward the voice, he saw a woman with wings. The woman introduced herself as the goddess Athena. She said that she guided the dead and granted them new lives, and without further ado, she would reincarnate him into another world. The boy was shocked and thought about what she meant by reincarnation. Athena confirmed that she had been moved, as a god, by the way he had protected that child. She explained that in the world of a novel game called Round Table Chronicles, she would reincarnate him as the protagonist. The boy was stunned and asked in disbelief if she really meant the protagonist. Athena smiled and confirmed it. The boy became excited and thought that his wish was suddenly coming true. He jumped with joy, saying that he was glad he had lived, but quickly corrected himself, realizing that he was dead. Athena smiled while watching him. The boy then thought that he had heard the title Round Table Chronicles before, and remembered that a friend had recommended it, though he had never got around to playing it. He realized he did not know the story, the characters, or their personalities, but then concluded that if it was the protagonist he admired, then it would be fine. He confidently said that he was counting on Athena. Athena told him that he would start at the age of 13, and his reincarnated self would be a boy named Faye. The boy acknowledged it and repeated the name, saying, "Faye got it." Athena then said, "Well then," and began to teleport him. Faye reacted with excitement as he was sent off. Athena smiled and told him to have a good journey. After Faye disappeared, Athena thought to herself that the whole part about reincarnating him as the protagonist had been a lie. Smiling, she revealed that Faye was just a minor, throwaway character in Round Table Chronicles. She thought that making him the real protagonist would be boring because she had seen too many isekai reincarnation stories and was tired of them. She then said that she would see what this boy could do. Later, in a house located in a forest, someone called out faintly to Faye, saying his name. Faye slowly opened his eyes and saw a woman named Maria beside him. Maria expressed her relief, saying that she had been worried because Faye's fever wouldn't go down. Faye looked around while thinking if he had really reincarnated. He touched his head and thought that it hurt. Maria asked if Faye was okay, and Faye tried to respond, saying he was fine, but his words came out awkwardly. He thought that something was strange, because his words were being changed somehow, wondering if that was just how this character spoke. Faye then picked up a towel from a bucket and saw his reflection in the water. He was shocked to see his face, and thought that for a protagonist, his face looked rather villainous. His eyes seemed a little too sharp, so he guessed that maybe he was the cool and aloof type of protagonist. Afterward, the scene shifted to the outside of the house, where some children were playing in the back. Faye was sitting on a bench, thinking that it had been a few days since he reincarnated, but no special events had happened. He decided it was time to organize his thoughts. He thought about how his name was Faye, he was 13 years old, and he was an orphan. He noted that the way he talked was very condescending, which must have been because he was a cool type protagonist. When Faye noticed a boy and girl staring at him, he wondered what it was about. Then he thought that the reason was probably because he stood out so much. When the boy and girl ran away, he told himself that cool type protagonists didn't really mingle with others and convinced himself that it was definitely not because they were disliked. Maria then called out to Faye while hanging up some clothes, asking how he was feeling. Faye replied that there was no problem. He thought that the nun at the orphanage, Maria, was super cute and that, apparently, she was 25 years old. He thought again that she was really cute. When Maria smiled and said that she was glad, Faye thought that she was the only one who actually cared about him and wondered if maybe she was a heroine candidate. Faye then opened a door while thinking that he had gotten sidetracked. As he read a book, he thought that since he did not know the story of the Round Table Chronicles, he had done some light research. He found out that it was a medieval fantasy world with swords and magic. In that world, there were people called Holy Knights who protected the people of Britannia from monstrous creatures known as demon beasts. He also learnt that one could take the entrance exam for the Holy Knights at 15 years old. Faye was suddenly surprised and thought that at 15, he could take the knight entrance exam. He imagined himself becoming a holy knight and dazzling people with his heroic exploits, surrounded by beautiful heroines and living an amazing life. He concluded that this must be the plan. With determination, he thought that meant he needed to train with a sword for the entrance exam in 2 years. A few months later, Faye was seen swinging a sword while wondering if he had gotten any stronger. Someone shouted at him, asking what he was scheming. Faye recognized the voice and saw that it was Toru. He thought that Toru kept messing with him and wondered if Toru could be a throwaway character. Toru asked if Faye was listening, but Faye responded coldly, saying that Toru was interrupting his training. Toru angrily told him not to mess around and said that there was no way Faye would actually be serious about training. He demanded to know if Faye had forgotten everything he had done until now. Faye, however, thought to himself that he didn't know anything from before his reincarnation. Toru pointed his sword at Faye and challenged him to a match, saying that if he won, Faye would have to tell him everything. Faye agreed and said he would show how amazing he was. Both of them took their stances as a boy in the background noticed and exclaimed that there was a fight, while a girl cheered for Toru to do his best. As a leaf fell, Faye attacked first, but Toru quickly countered and hit Faye in the stomach. Faye's face turned pale, and he fell to the ground. Faye was confused and thought that, as the protagonist, what just happened must have been some kind of gag. He stood up again and kept attacking, but Toru dodged every move. Faye continued to attack again and again until he fell to the ground once more. He thought that Toru's movements were too fast and that there was no way he could win at this rate. Then he paused and thought that maybe this was a crisis for the protagonist. He suddenly smiled and wondered if this could be an awakening event, the moment when the protagonist, unaware of his special power, awakens when pushed to the brink. He convinced himself that he just had to endure until the awakening happened, believing that the event would teach him not to give up. Excitedly, he thought that this was exactly the kind of event he had always wanted to experience. With a smile, he attacked again, thinking that this was a thrilling, blood-pumping moment and that he would overcome the trial. However, a few minutes later, Faye was beaten up and fell to the ground again. He thought, wondering when the awakening would happen, and speculated that maybe he had to be even more cornered for it to occur. Toru looked down at him, scoffed, and turned to leave. Faye clenched his fist and thought, "Bring it on." He stood up weakly and said that it was not yet over. Toru turned around with a tense expression as Faye continued to say that the battle wasn't over yet. Toru struck Faye on the head, calling him persistent, but Faye smiled through the pain and tried to attack again, missing his strike. He muttered that it wasn't enough and that he needed more. Smiling eerily, Toru stared at him tensely, thinking about what kind of person Faye was. When Toru looked into Faye's eyes, he felt something swirling deep within them, an abyss filled with terrifying obsession, as if something Faye had longed for over countless years was boiling inside him. The immense pressure made Toru back off in fear. Toru then yelled for Faye to stay away and hurriedly told him to fall down already while continuing to attack. As Toru prepared for his final strike, Maria suddenly appeared from behind, shouting at him to stop. Toru froze and turned around, shocked to see Sister Maria. She asked him why he was doing this. Toru stammered an apology. Maria quickly went to Faye and asked if he was okay, only to be shocked when she realized that he was unconscious while still standing. Faye's thoughts echoed faintly as he recalled that Faye was the throwaway character of Round Table Hero Chronicles, and that Toru was one of the protagonists of Round Table Hero Chronicles. Toru's expression tensed as Faye's final thought lingered. Toru had no way of knowing. Then the scene shifted, showing the house. Faye opened his eyes and saw Maria sitting beside him, asleep on the chair. Faye wondered where his awakening was and questioned why it had not happened yet. He thought to himself that he was supposed to be the protagonist and doubted whether the gods had reincarnated the wrong person. He quickly reassured himself that there was no way God would make such a mistake and concluded that this must be a meaningful defeat indeed. Faye then sat up on the bed, let out a small laugh, and realized that it was a protagonist-only loss event, one of those classic early game moments where the protagonist faced an unbeatable enemy. He reasoned that the story must have progressed even though he lost, and that this was the part where the protagonist realized their weakness and grew stronger from it. At that moment, Maria woke up and looked at Faye in concern, asking if he was okay. Faye confidently claimed that he was fine, waving his hand dismissively and saying that this level of injury was just a scratch, but immediately screamed in pain. Maria became alarmed and scolded him, saying he had been seriously injured. Faye, now uncertain, held his shoulder and wondered if that was really true. Maria sighed and muttered that she would scold True later, but Faye told her that it would not be necessary. Maria looked at him in confusion, and Faye explained that the battle had been something he needed. In his thoughts, Faye concluded that this event probably set up a future plot point. Maria stared at him in surprise and asked why he had suddenly started wielding a sword. Faye replied that it was because he was the protagonist, and figured he should start training early, though in his mind, he knew he could not say that aloud. He remembered the monsters called Omasaida, and resolved to get stronger to defeat them. Faye declared that he would, of course, reach even greater heights. He clenched his fist with determination and loudly proclaimed that he would become a holy knight and annihilate all the Omasaida. Maria was shocked, while Faye proudly thought that he had nailed it. A protagonist always needed a grand purpose. Seeing her expression, Faye was confused and wondered why Maria's reaction was not what he expected. Maria hesitated before reminding him that his parents had been killed by the Omasaida, and said they probably would not want him to do something so dangerous. Faye realized, from her words, that his parents had indeed been killed by the Omasaida, and he thought that he needed to add, avenging my parents, to his quest. He declared that even so, he would fight for his parents and for the world. When Maria's face tensed, Faye wondered why she looked that way. Maria then apologized, saying she had not realized it before, and admitting that she had tried to act like a parent to him to make sure he would never feel lonely. She confessed that he had been lonely ever since his parents' deaths, and that this loneliness was what drove him toward revenge. Faye, visibly tense, was startled and thought that he was not feeling lonely or anything of the sort. He quickly told Maria that he did not remember anything from back then, so she should not worry about it. In his mind, Faye pieced together that her tense expression and reaction must have been because of this. Maria still seemed troubled, but Faye reassured her that there was no need to worry. He thought to himself that Maria was genuinely worried for him, and he began to feel guilty for not being the real Faye. He regretted that he had not even played the game beforehand. Maria reached out, touched his face gently, and suddenly hugged him. Faye blushed intensely, stunned by the sudden gesture, and wondered why she was doing it. As Maria held him close, Faye debated internally whether he should hug her back, but then thought that cool characters would not just hug someone casually. Maria softly told Faye that it was okay, and that she would always be with him. Faye was frozen in surprise as she continued, confessing that she loved him. Faye closed his eyes and wondered if Maria was one of the heroines after all. Then the scene shifted. Maria was bathing. She undressed, stepped into the water, and let out a sigh of relief. Faye's thoughts narrated that Sister Maria had once fought against the Omasaida as a holy knight until a few years ago, but now she ran an orphanage and cared for the orphans. In the visual novel Legends of the Round Table, she was the foster parent of the main protagonist, True, and was one of the heroines if the player followed her route. Maria looked sad as she thought about Faye. She admitted to herself that she had not been good with him, a boy who had been arrogant and closed off to everyone, including her. Before she realized it, she had naturally started keeping her distance as well. But ever since the day Faye had been bedridden with a high fever, he had changed. He had begun training earnestly with his sword and reading books, and he had stopped bothering the other children. Maria recalled Faye's declaration that he would annihilate the Omasaida, and thought that he must have made that resolve during his illness. She remembered that she too had once chosen to live as a revenger, becoming a holy knight to avenge her own parents by fighting the Omasaida. She reflected that she had nearly died many times, and no matter how many she defeated, the flames of revenge had never gone away. What had finally soothed those flames, she remembered, was the moment a child had thanked her for saving them. The children's smiles had saved her heart, and she had sworn that she would be the one to save theirs next. Maria smiled softly at the thought. Then she thought of Faye again, sitting alone, and realized she had failed to notice the loneliness hidden behind his clumsy attitude. She regretted not facing him properly and not loving him when she should have. She believed that if she had, perhaps he would not have chosen the path of revenge. Still in the bath, Maria resolved that there was still time. She swore that she would not let Faye do something as dangerous as revenge, and that if he ever chose that path, she would stop him until the day he hugged her back. The scene then shifted once more, showing Faye thinking that Maria was completely overthinking things and misunderstanding everything. 2 years passed. The next scene opened with Faye, now 15 years old, standing at the door. He thought to himself that he was on his way to the Holy Knight's entrance exam. Behind him, Maria stood silently, watching. The scene shifted to the royal capital, Britannia, where the streets were crowded with people. The focus then turned to the Night Order headquarters, also known as the Castle of the Round Table. Faye was standing there, saying that finally, the time had come. Faye thought that it had been 2 years since he was reincarnated as the protagonist of Round Table Chronicles, and that a lot of things had happened during that time. When Faye saw some people nearby, he thought to himself that all of them were his supporting cast, and thanked them internally for playing their part. Then, Faye's eyes caught sight of a boy, and he wondered if that boy was Toru. Faye thought with surprise whether Toru was also going to take the entrance exam, and quickly hid behind a wall, thinking that Toru was just a mob, yet aiming to become a knight. Faye convinced himself that it was not like he was avoiding Toru or anything like that. Meanwhile, Toru saw Faye and, recognizing him, felt a wave of trauma. Toru turned away, thinking that it was better to stay away from Faye. The scene then shifted to a field, where Faye was standing alone near a tree. Faye thought that, in his opinion, it was a cool standby pose. Suddenly, Faye heard someone approaching and assumed it might be Toru. However, when Faye turned, he saw that it was a girl. Faye immediately thought that she was a super beautiful woman and wondered why she was coming his way. With a tense expression, Faye thought that there was no way was she perhaps a heroine. But then Faye remembered that he already had Maria. At that moment, someone suddenly clapped their hands from the side, catching Faye's attention, and said to everyone to pay attention. Faye looked and saw that it was a man. The man greeted everyone with a cheerful, "Good afternoon," and introduced himself as Maru, a holy knight of the 5th rank. Faye thought, a 5th rank, holy knight, huh? And recalled that in the Britannian kingdom, the ranks of holy knights went from 12th rank to 1st rank, where the lower the number, the higher the rank. Faye also remembered that their rank could be identified by the design of the emblem on their chest. Maru continued speaking, saying that since they were always short on knights, they were holding recruitment exams. He added that everyone present was so good that he could pretty much say they had already passed. One of the boys responded with surprise, saying that the exam was a piece of cake. Faye, however, thought to himself whether it was really okay for an examiner to have such an attitude. Maru then announced that, just in case, they would run an aptitude test and instructed everyone to get into pairs and start a mock battle immediately. A boy happily exclaimed that someone wanted to team up with him. Faye looked at the group and thought that those guys seemed so listless. As Faye walked toward them, he reminded himself that he was the protagonist, and that he despised soft-minded ideas like cutting corners. Determined, Faye decided that he would give his all and shouted loudly, asking who wanted to team up with him. However, the crowd fell silent, and Faye realized that there was nobody available. At that moment, the beautiful woman from earlier called out to him. Faye saw her, and thought that it was the same beautiful woman he had noticed before. Turning toward her, Faye remarked with slight arrogance that she had chosen him, and the woman replied that yes, she had after all. There was no one else left. Faye thought that her way of speaking was rather harsh, but despite that, she was so beautiful that it felt like a waste. Faye noticed that the woman looked a bit tense, and she asked him what was wrong with his face. Faye questioned what she meant by that, and wondered in his thoughts if she was implying that his face was ugly. Arthur, however, thought that she might have given the wrong impression and needed to explain herself properly. She clarified that while the others were taking it easy, Faye was the only one who wasn't. She asked why that was. Faye was surprised and realized that was all she meant. Internally, Faye thought that if hearing the word pass was enough to make someone slack off, then they had already failed as a main character. Faye replied seriously that no matter the circumstances, one must always control oneself and overcome their limits, because otherwise they would never grow. It was as simple as that. Arthur looked confused for a moment, and Faye wondered whether she had been overwhelmed by his cool words and perhaps had fallen in love with him. Arthur then asked Faye if he had known the truth the whole time. Faye replied in confusion, and Arthur explained that although Maru had said they passed, he never said that he wouldn't rank those who passed. She reasoned that since they would be risking their lives as holy knights, there was no way there wouldn't be a test. It was clearly a test of how well they could discipline themselves even in a complacent environment. Arthur concluded that Faye had known he was being examined all along. Faye was shocked but tried to maintain composure, replying naturally, even though in his mind he admitted that he hadn't known at all. Arthur was impressed, thinking that Faye's force of will and insight were incredible qualities that she herself overwhelmingly lacked. Arthur wondered how Faye could stick to such a lofty path of solitude without ever being carried along by circumstance. She thought that she wanted to know more about him. Arthur then declared that she wanted to team up with Faye. Faye agreed, and Arthur asked for his name. Faye told her his name, and Arthur introduced herself as Arthur. Faye repeated her name in surprise and thought that somehow her name sounded like a protagonist's. Faye realized that it made sense. Arthur, as well as Toru, was the main pillar of the protagonists. Inside the novel game Round Table Chronicles, those two were the main characters. In addition, there were various sub-protagonists. The story was originally supposed to progress from their perspectives, but due to the intrusion of Faye, a stepping stone character who wasn't even a sub-protagonist, the story had become something that no one could have predicted. Then, Faye and Arthur stood facing each other with wooden swords. Faye thought that even gods could not have predicted what was about to unfold. Arthur readied her stance and said that she was going to begin. Faye agreed and thought that it was time to get started their battle. Faye lunged to attack her, but Arthur swiftly jumped and dodged, countering with a strike that sliced close to Faye's face. Faye was stunned, thinking in disbelief that Arthur had disappeared, and wondered just who she really was. Then, Faye and Arthur were seen fighting, and Faye was struggling. Arthur was about to land a blow when Faye's sword flew away. Arthur thought that Faye was not strong at all. Faye continued attacking, and Arthur observed that as Faye possessed an outstanding force of will, she had thought he would definitely have exceptional swordsmanship as well, but he was a bit disappointing. While Arthur dodged, she thought that even so, his swordsmanship was strange and wondered what on earth that school of swordsmanship was, or whether it might be a self-taught style. Faye looked at Arthur's face and thought that she had a pretty face and that she was incredibly strong. Arthur easily reflected every attack, and Faye realized that despite being this strong, Arthur had not tried to hit him with her sword even once. Faye concluded that Arthur was clearly going easy on him. Faye's sword flew into the air again, and as he went to retrieve it, he cursed in frustration. Arthur then asked why his swordsmanship was so weird. Faye's face turned angry as he thought once again about his face, wondering whether she disliked it so much. Faye thought that it seemed like Arthur wanted to say, "Why are your sword skills so weird?" For an instant, Faye had thought she was a heroine, but then he realized she was one of the many rivals with a bad personality in the game. Arthur yawned and wondered if they were still going to continue, while Faye thought to himself that this time, for sure, he would win. They continued fighting, and from the side, a boy asked what was wrong with Faye, while another said that Faye could not even use art. Faye reflected that, in simple terms, art was a phenomenon similar to magic. Art existed within everyone, but Faye did not know how to use it. Faye was panting heavily while Arthur remained composed. Arthur thought that Faye had not given up yet, even though he should have known from experience that he could not defeat her. Yet, Arthur found it strange that every time Faye fought against her, his spirit seemed to increase. It was almost as though he became stronger through adverse circumstances. Arthur thought it was like watching a hero, and that Faye could become a true hero someday, but without power, none of that would matter. In this world, Arthur knew that power was everything. It was a world where the abyss and criminals ran rampant, and those without power were simply prey. Even the most atrocious and inhuman experiments were permitted. Arthur believed that the strength of one's spirit alone could not change anything, and thought to herself that it was an ugly world. She concluded that just because someone never gave up did not mean their hard work would pay off, and she thought that a man who could not even control art could never defeat her. Faye then fell to the ground, and his sword landed on his face. Some people nearby began laughing. Arthur turned and saw a girl mocking Faye, saying that it was hilarious. A boy remarked that Faye tried to act cool, but was actually pathetic, and another said that no matter how hard he tried, it was pointless and that he should just give up already. Faye noticed them, and Arthur thought about why they were laughing, realizing that Faye was trying so hard and that she could not stand to watch them laugh at him any longer. Arthur then touched her face and activated her eye, saying to herself that she would put an end to this. She commanded Faye to sleep, and Faye was stunned, falling to his knees. Arthur turned away, thinking that it was over and that she knew it would come to this. Suddenly, Faye's voice rang out, asking who said it was over. Arthur turned to see him, but he was gone. She then saw him in the air, preparing to attack her. Arthur tried to block, and their swords crossed, breaking simultaneously. Arthur was shocked and thought that her magical eye had no effect and wondered why. The magical eye, she knew, was a special power housed in one's eyes, which could only be awakened through innate talent. The eye Arthur possessed was the magical eye of domination. It was a form of suggestion that allowed the user to forcibly control any target they made eye contact with by consuming art. At first, the magical eye appeared incredibly powerful, like a royal straight flush that won the instant it was revealed. However, it was not perfect. There were weaknesses and countermeasures against it. The first was another magical eye user depending on the matchup. A magical eye could be countered by another. The second was if the opponent possessed some form of resistance, such as resistance built up from repeated exposure to the magical eye, an innate special immunity, or a special item that countered it. The third was avoiding eye contact if the eyes never met, the power was useless. The fourth was if the target was already under a pre-existing suggestion that was more powerful than whatever the magical eye imposed. Faye fell into this fourth category. For the 2 years since he had reincarnated as Faye, he had told himself every single day, "I am the protagonist." Faye had declared that the protagonist never died, and that because he was the main character, he would always find a way. That self-suggestion had been elevated into a belief so powerful that it could nullify even the highest-class magical eye. Faye then exclaimed triumphantly, asking if Arthur had seen that, declaring that the protagonist never, ever gave up, no matter the crisis, and that in the end, he always won. He walked toward Arthur, while Arthur stood stunned and blushing. Marumaru announced that the exam was over, and Faye, shocked, asked if it was already finished. He pointed at Arthur and proclaimed that he would defeat her next time. Arthur was confused but thought to herself that he had actually made her get serious. While smiling, Arthur thought that it was incredible and that she could not believe something like this was even possible. She reflected that she had always been dreaming about this, a person who could set her free from the darkness. As she watched Faye leave, she thought that maybe he was the one who could shatter this cruel reality and silently hoped that if they ever met again, they could be friends.
By the way, if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider liking and subscribing, pretty please?